has worked in student housing professionally for over 6 years at several schools across Canada. Her time at the University of Guelph at the beginning of her career was such a positive experience that she couldn't resist going back. Currently, she works as a residence life manager at the University of Guelph, where she supervises a team of RAs and provides support to over 500 students. Through her career, she had the opportunity to lead a number of impactful initiatives, from conducting reviews on mental health training and policy standards for a private student housing company to researching best practices for supporting neurodivergent staff after identifying a clear gap and addressing those needs. Bailee is passionate about creating a welcoming and inclusive environment for students and wants to break down the stereotype of the kind of person that can succeed in student housing work. So thank you, Bailee.
Oh, thank you, Alyssa. Okay, let's all see if sharing my screen works. I'm really hopeful. I'm really hopeful. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, with how this is displayed, Alyssa, I would be ever so grateful if you could very much help me with the chat function and any questions that come up. Please and thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Wonderful. Hello, everyone. As Alyssa said, my name is Bailee. I'm a residence life manager at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario. And so this is a presentation that I did at the Ontario Association of College and University Housing Officers presentation or conference back in June. And yeah, we'll get into it. So I first wanted to start out just by doing a land acknowledgement. So the land that, that I'm currently on is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect resources, and not to engage in conflict. However, to make my land acknowledgement a little bit more specific, I actually wanted to talk about, where I spent most of my informative and transformative years growing up in my hometown of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is a border city with Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And so Sault Ste. Marie is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the lands of the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, as well as the Métis people. This region is within the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. And so this picture here on the screen is of Shingwak Hall, which is a residential school that was actually located in Sault Ste. Marie. Shingwak Hall was established as part of the Shingwak Industrial Home, which was a residential school intended to educate, in air quotes, but really assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian, into Catholic, into Protestant culture. The institution was opened in 1873, and it was actually named after Chief Shingwak of the Garden River First Nations. And he had originally envisioned this establishment as a teaching wigwam to provide better education to Anishinaabe children, which, as we unfortunately have learned, is not what happened. The hall remained open until 1970, meaning it was open for a little over 100 years. The year following its closure, the building still stood and was actually repurposed into Algoma University College, which now, if my arrow buttons want to move forward.
I don't think your screen's not sharing for me. I'm not sure if it isn't for others.
No, it's not. Oh, it's showing that it is. Let's see. Oh, haha. That's so funny. Can you see that?
I see it now. Yep.
That's so hilarious. That's fine.
All good.
So anyways, thank you, Alyssa. So this is, thank you for the thumbs up. That is the validation that I needed. So this is the picture that I was referencing of Shingwak Hall as it originally stood as a residential school. And then the dramatic effects was the next slide here in order for you to actually see that center part of what is now Algoma University, one of the few universities in all of Northern Ontario. So a really prime post-secondary education opportunity for especially Northern Ontario students. That section in the middle there is the original building that once was a residential school. And so I highlight this for quite a few reasons, as like one of the biggest being that it is a quite literal example of how much colonialism is embedded in our education systems, no matter where we are, both quite literally in that this building has been repurposed, not to mention the many ways in which the colonialism as part of residential schools in terms of making sure Indigenous children were being a certain way, acting a certain way, getting rid of their culture is still so deeply embedded in the ways in which our education systems are present now, right? And whether that's policies, whether that's procedures, whether that's just like the different systems that exist. And so I hope that from this, you just take away for the rest of this presentation, and also as you know, continue on with the work that you do, consider the many ways in which colonialism is still present in the work that we do as educators on a daily basis. And so we have a few learning outcomes that I'm hoping that by the end of this we'll accomplish. So I'm hopeful that by the end you'll be able to describe how your workplace structures contribute to the lack of accessibility for neurodivergent staff. I'm hoping that you'll be able to identify strategies or solutions to address accessibility regarding neurodiversity in the workplace. And then lastly, this one's going to look a little bit different just because of the limited functionality of the webinar. But I'm hopeful that with resources that I will make sure that Alyssa is able to pass along to everyone. You'll be able to create a personalized resource toolkit to support and coach neurodivergent staff. So this last one, in previous times that I've done this presentation, a big part of that is like breakout work and groups, but we have some limitations with the webinar, and that's okay. We're going to pivot and all is good. So in order to accomplish those learning objectives, we have an agenda that we're hopefully going to cover all of that will help us accomplish those things. So I'll talk a little bit about my own lived experiences and why I'm so passionate about this topic. We'll cover the history and definition of neurodiversity. We'll talk a little bit about the ecological model of disability. We'll cover some employment and statistics, and disclaimer that the statistics are Canadian. However, I would be surprised if the stats aren't quite similar in an American or really anywhere other like countries context too. We'll talk about universal design learning and some strategies for how we can implement that into hiring, onboarding, and coaching. And then the activity is going to be a little bit different just because of some of the limitations, and that's okay. So why I'm here and talking about this. So I have a few different diagnoses that actually have impacted how I show up day to day. And so one of those being post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think for all of us in the work that we do is we become more trauma informed, and we learn more about the ways in which trauma like truly impacts your entire nervous system. It's more and more evident why PTSD does fall under that neurodivergent category, and that like when your brain has been rewired a different way and is constantly looking and perceiving everything as a threat to try and keep you safe, of course that's going to be able to, or of course that's going to impact your brain's ability to process everything else. In my third year of my undergrad, I got into a car accident and I got a concussion. And so there were certain elements, certain symptoms from that concussion that were temporary. And there are certain symptoms of that concussion now having been over 10 years later that are still present with me to this day. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And in addition to those two things, I have a couple chronic mood disorder diagnoses. And again, depending on kind of where I'm at with a whole lot of different things, that's going to impact my executive function. It's going to impact my energy levels and really just impact my ability to show up day to day, whether that's in school, whether that's in the workplace. And so, as I said, like there's a multitude of ways in which these things have impacted how I show up every day. And so one of the biggest ones is emotional regulation. And this one is very much related to and tied into the PTSD, in that, I might be in a meeting and someone might say something a certain way, or someone might we just might be talking about something that just like is an unexpected trigger. And so then instead of being present, engaged, and focused in that meeting, I'm spending the rest of that time trying to not have it show on my face and trying to internally regulate and trying to just really make sure that my body knows that I am not, there are no threats, that I'm not in danger. And again, like, of course, like if I am doing that all while an important meeting's happening, I'm going to be missing out on some stuff that's going on in that meeting. So sensory experiences. So right now I have my overhead lighting on, which I don't turn on for me. I turn on for the benefit of those that I am engaging with. Because for me, things like lighting can be really, really overstimulating, whether it's just the beauty of fluorescent lighting and just like how visually stimulating it is, all the way to sometimes if I'm overstimulated in general. I love the person who reacted to that. Thank you. If I'm overstimulated in general, like I might even be able to hear the lighting. That's something that really came about after my concussion as well. And so again, like I truly only ever have overhead lighting on for the benefit of others because I recognize that it might be a little bit weird to show up for meetings or to be on calls in complete darkness. Executive function. And so specifically how this looks like for me is both as a student and as a professional now, things that I often struggle with related to executive function are like small menial tasks that are important, but it's the repetitive, the tedious nature of them that just makes it seem like this like huge, inconvenient, insurmountable thing. And so through a lot of trial and error, I've been able to figure out ways to help me make sure that I get my documentation all sorted and stuff like that. But there's certain functions of the job on the day to day that just are challenging sometimes depending on where I'm at with other things. And then lastly, this is a big one also related to the concussion that I had and a long lasting, at this point, likely lifelong impact is my audio processing. So if I'm having a conversation with someone and they're giving me instructions, okay, Bailee, first you need to do this, then you need to go here, then you need to go here. It's going in one ear and right out the other. I'm not remembering what happened. And it wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 months after my car accident, I'm watching Netflix and the closed captions just happened to be turned on, which you hopefully can see also in this presentation. The closed captions just happened to be turned on a show that I was watching. And I realized about 5-10 minutes into watching the show that all of a sudden it was significantly easier for me to follow along with what was actually happening. I knew the storyline, I knew the plot line, and I went, oh, would you look at this? There's something that I can actually do to try and make things a little bit easier for me. And so again, through a lot of trial and error, through a lot of developing confidence, I've been able to figure out what it is that I need, especially in the workplace, to be able to succeed on an individual level, which again, looks very different from person to person. And I've also been able to develop that confidence to advocate for myself. But the purpose of this conversation, the purpose of this presentation is in hopes that for us, in roles where we're supervising staff, in roles where we're responsible for hiring staff, like what can we do to help make it up a more like level the playing field essentially. So I see a couple things in chat. Oh yeah. Oh, I appreciate the comments in the chat. Thank you so much. That was validating. History of neurodiversity as a concept. So the concept is actually related to biodiversity. So if there's anyone that was a bio student at some point, you are likely familiar with the concept. And so in, sorry, lost my train of thought there. In reality, like a high level of biodiversity is not just desirable, but is actually necessary for a thriving ecosystem. Because think about like, especially in the context of like crops, right? You might have some genetic variations between different crops, and certain crops might actually be more likely to survive certain bugs that are really common in a certain environment, or especially in these times of changing climate, certain crops might be more likely to survive different changes in our climate. Again, making it so that we can continue to grow certain foods and things like that. And the same thing extends for really anything in our ecosystems. And it ultimately really that emphasis on importance of biodiversity really also emphasizes that like every single role, every single thing plays an important role. And so advocates and the disability advocates thought that instead of pathologizing symptoms that we often see with diagnoses like autism and ADHD, instead of constantly pathologizing, constantly like really focusing on the deficits, what if we also focused and took the time to recognize the strengths of folks with different neurodivergent conditions? Hence the term neurodiversity being born. So the term neurodiversity as it stands is an umbrella term, and especially in like I feel like any field where there's research related to mental health in the brain, like it's constantly changing. There's constantly so much that's being done. So there's not necessarily like a universally agreed upon standardized definition. However, through a lot of my research, it seems as though researchers often break it up into like 4 overarching subtypes. So you have applied developmental, so that includes conditions like dyslexia and dyscalculia. And so the applied signifies like conditions that are related to like educational skills or like skills that require like application, such as reading or motor control. And then the developmental indicates like someone was born with that. So that is like how their brain was hardwired in utero coming out. You have your clinical developmental subtype, which encompasses Tourette syndrome, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And so again, that developmental indicating that like that is something that someone has just had since birth. And then the clinical indicates specific behavioral skills. So things like communication, self-control. You have your acquired potentially transient. So the acquired indicates just like at some point throughout someone's life, something happens in their brain chemistry, their neurology has changed. And the potentially transient indicates that like it can come and go, which is why different mental illnesses, such as anxiety, such as really other mood disorders, can fall into this category, because sometimes someone's depression might be so debilitating and disabling that they may like consider themselves neurodivergent because of just how much it's impacting their ability to function day to day. Whereas like other times in their life, like they might not even meet the clinical criteria for that diagnosis. And then lastly, just like a general acquired, so things like different neurological illnesses or brain injuries, such as concussions, as I mentioned. Again, acquired indicating that like it's something that happened to the brain at some point throughout that person's lifespan. And so when it comes to like, we're not diving deep into like clinical diagnostic stuff, but this is just a really helpful way to visualize some of our next topics of conversation. So here in this chart, you'll see like 2 different profiles, as this study refers to it as. So you'll see one profile, which is like evenly distributed across 4 different skills that were assessed. So you have verbal skills, working memory, visual skills, and processing speed. And so again, one profile, like just very average across the board, evenly distributed across the different skills. Then you have a second profile, which in the next slide you'll see is referred to as a spiky profile, really just indicating the spikes in the profile, where verbal skills and visual skills are quite high, but working memory and processing speeds are quite low. And so in isolation, none of these skills that are being assessed are inherently disabling, right? And that's not to say that there's not power. That's not to say that there's, that there's not power in identifying as disabled. But it's just really to further indicate that oftentimes it's not always just any deficits in a specific skill that makes us disabled. Oftentimes it's our environment, and when we're placing these skills into different environments, that we find ourselves maybe being more or less disabled. And so here, as I mentioned, so the neurotypical profile, as I'm sure hopefully many of you guessed, was that of a neurotypical profile, like the average across different skills. Whereas the spiky profile is often quite reflective of many different neurodivergent diagnoses. And it's not even just like this is for specifically autism or specifically ADHD. In general, neurodivergent folks, regardless of diagnosis, do typically tend to struggle more with working memory and with processing speed. So again, as we talked about, oftentimes it's when you place certain symptoms or experiences, whatever, in different contexts is where we're going to see maybe more or less disabled experiences. And so that's where something like the ecological model of disability can be really helpful in kind of contextualizing all of this. So this model was developed using Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And so at the center of it all, you'll see the individual, and that's just like their own individual experiences, right? So some of the experiences and impacts that I talked about being like executive function, working memory, emotional regulation. Those are my individual experiences that are going to be different in different systems or environments. This is where I am hoping, let's try chat because I feel like that's probably easiest for a webinar. But I'm hoping in the chat to get a little bit of engagement with some of this. So what do we think the microsystem is? Or like, what do we think some examples of a microsystem are? And I'll open up the chat to see. Close friends or loved ones? Yep, yeah. Any other examples of what we think the like immediate microsystem is? Immediate family, yep. Social circle, yeah, those that like you're interacting with on a frequent basis. Amazing, great. Exactly that, your immediate environment. So the people that you're seeing the most. So whether that's your family that you're seeing very frequently, whether that's your schoolmates that you're seeing very frequently, your coworkers, yeah, different clubs or organizations that someone's a part of, for sure. Amazing. Okay, your mesosystem. So right above that, what do we think examples of, oh, that, okay, no, I'm not going to word it that way because that won't, what do we think the mesosystem is rather? And feel free to put into the chat what you think the mesosystem is. Really after microsystem is where most people get stumped. Work or classroom environment. Oh, okay. Nice. Good one, Brianna or Brianna. Yeah. Work, more structured environments. Yep. Yeah. So those are very good examples for sure. And so specifically with the context of like work or classroom environments, the mesosystem actually refers to the interactions between your microsystems. So how, like what my relationship with my family looks like in regards to the symptoms that I experience is going to impact how I show up in work or at work, or it's going to impact how I show up in the classroom. So for example, like if I come from a super supportive family that had me enrolled in like lots of different things, had me in therapy, all that stuff, really was building up my coping skills, my resiliency and stuff like that, that's going to likely positively impact how I show up in the classroom setting, how I show up at work. Conversely, if I don't have a super supportive family, and like people who just like aren't very educated, aren't very aware, and I'm like really struggling with anxiety, that's going to likely negatively impact how I show up at work or in the school, like in a school setting, because I don't necessarily have other folks trying to like help build me up, help increase that resiliency. Yeah. Your microsystem is the support system that helps prepare or not you to succeed in the mesosystem. Exactly. Yeah. Great way of framing that. What do we think the exosystem is? This is going much better than I was expecting, like with the chat, I mean. So thank you, everyone. I'll give it a moment before I explain. It's also completely fine if no one knows. Yeah, yes, DeMarcus, yes. So it's external environments that indirectly affect the individual, external influencers. Oh, heck yeah, we're crushing it. Look at us. So exactly that. So like things like societal attitudes. So how we like the different norms or the different stereotypes. Oh, hi, Aiden. The different stereotypes that we have about neurodivergent folks. Yeah, I think social media really would fit into that, into the exo category, because again, like what kind of narrative, what kind of influence is it having on the ways in which we're like visualizing like what we think in terms of neurodivergent people. And then the macro system, I'll just give this away to everyone, is larger cultural and societal context. So this is where we see specifically like, and so it's like a little bit nuanced in between like exo and macro. But so the macro system, one of the biggest examples that I like to give for this is just like the laws surrounding like mental health, or just really our legal system as a whole. I think many of us can think about some unfortunate instances where in particular like autistic folks might be having some sort of meltdown, police are called, things don't always end well because of the knowledge and the understanding that like our legal system has about neurodivergent folks and how that might present when they're feeling overwhelmed, when they're feeling flustered. And so again, as I said, like the different systems here are going to impact like how someone's going to show up daily, right? Like, so maybe, you know, I have a super supportive home life and I am super privileged and blessed to be going to super like progressive and supportive school. But then when I go into the workplace, right? And we'll get into this in a few slides when we talk about some stats. When I go into the workplace, I have no supports at all. And so like I can try to have all this other stuff at home or in my personal life to really build me up. But then when I'm in a different environment that's not meeting those needs at all, like it almost sometimes can feel like, you know, things are being done in vain. Amazing. Wonderful. Okay, so some common challenges of neurodivergent folks in the workplace include things like time management, concentration and attention, self-regulation deficits, especially time management and self-regulation deficits can also show up because sometimes if someone's like super passionate, super hyper focused on like a specific thing that they're doing at work, some of the other important stuff as part of their job responsibilities might not be completed because they're just so focused on the one thing that is really giving them excitement and meaning and purpose. Literacy can be a really big one, especially when you think of things like dyslexia and dyscalculia. Literacy also doesn't just have to be like actually like how to read. Literacy can also, and I think this is where it can be really important in the context of the work that we do, both with student staff and with professional staff. It's not just literacy in the sense of, like I said, being able to read. It's literacy in the sense of, okay, you give someone a paper to read and they need to skim through it, be able to synthesize that or summarize what you just gave them. That's going to take some people a lot longer. And so when are we incorporating things like that into training for student staff, and like how incredibly challenging and disheartening that can be for some folks. Memory, with a particular emphasis on working memory. And working memory is like your short-term immediate memory. So the example I gave is if someone gave me only verbal directions, I'm not knowing how to get to a place. I need you to write it out. And then lastly, organization. And so I'm hoping in the chat, I'm hoping that some folks can share some examples of strengths that they think neurodivergent folks might have in the workplace. So good at brainstorming or finding detailed critiques on things. Yep. Well-composed emails to students. Oh yeah. Yep. I don't know if it's a stereotype, but it's a stereotype that I myself fit of I can write an email like no one's business. Lived experience and perspective of students what might be experiencing. Yeah, that's a huge one. Strong empathy, seeing a problem in a different lens. Yep. Wide array of knowledge and skills. Yeah. So think back to that one chart that I showed too, right? Like when we're building teams, do we want just like a staffing complement that's just a bunch of generalists, or should we be building a staff like a team that complements one another? And so some people might be stronger in certain areas, and then the other parts of your team are like able to kind of fill in the gaps of things that they maybe struggle with. Seeing a problem in different lens, whatever. Representation and voice. Yeah, representation is something really, really important, especially in the higher education context. And that's something that I like really value about the work that I do when I have my student meetings, is being able to break down what like this stereotypical university person looks like, right? A colleague who's super organized and does almost all Excel sheets in the department in great detail. Yep. Yeah, let me tell you, you give me an Excel sheet, no thank you. Oh, see, that's so funny. Yeah. And again, things are going to be different for everyone. Me and numbers don't get along, is the moral of the story. But yeah, so we covered, I think, all of my lists. So creative thinking, detail observation, pattern recognition and detail observation, my biggest strengths, visual reasoning, storytelling, and hyper focus. And so again, in the context of the work that we do, whether it's with student staff or whether it's with like full-time professional staff, making sure that whether it's in training or whether it's like even like as we go on as folks are doing their jobs, how can we ensure that there's different tasks that are catering to different strengths and skill sets? And so again, to like further illustrate again, like how disabling or enabling, we'll go with, an environment can be. I think some of these stats can be really interesting to kind of contextualize everything, especially because I know for myself, something that I hear pretty common rhetoric is like, well, everyone's autistic these days. Everyone has ADHD these days. And so what are some of the things that are impacting the incidents that we're seeing this? So dyslexia was only discovered around the same time that literacy became mainstream through education. So before everyone was in public school and going to school every day and everyone was learning how to read, of course, we're not going to really recognize any trends and commonalities in folks not being able to, or like having challenges with reading, because it's not the norm. ADHD became more prevalent with the increasing sedentary lifestyles from the Industrial Revolution. So instead of lots of folks doing like really physically demanding jobs, right? Like whether it's working on farms, whether it like just anything that really requires like that physical activity, as everyone's like put into a cubicle, as everyone's put into put into a factory, and like they're given their very specific part of the conveyor belt that they need to do, and like it's only one task that they need to be doing, of course we're going to notice something like ADHD more. And quite similarly too, so developmental coordination disorder, which is a neurological condition that affects like movement coordination in people. Again, that also becomes more noticed during the Industrial Revolution, when like you're assigned a very specific part on that conveyor belt. And also as like everything that we do becomes like a keyboard, or everything becomes just clicking of a certain button, right? Like that fine motor control is very important for the work that most of us do on a daily basis. And again, that's going to become more noticeable when people have deficits in it, because of the nature of what like most of our work looks like. And then lastly, like autism increases in line with modern frequency of social communication and sensory stimulation. So I think us more than anyone can speak to like how constantly connected everyone is now, especially students. Like there's, whether it's social media, whether it's just like the nature of like how universities and student residences are set up, right? Like social communication is constant in so many different ways, not to mention the amount of sensory input that all of us have. Like I'm presenting this on a computer, I am getting notifications from my teams as I'm doing this presentation. I have my cell phone with notifications. Like I have my friggin' overhead lighting. There's just so much sensory input that's going on at once that, again, when someone who is more sensitive to that sensory input has all of that going on constantly, like again, it's going to be more noticeable that someone is struggling with that. So employment statistics. So I think I prefaced earlier that like these are in a Canadian context. Again, I would be surprised if they're not similar in the American context, but do want to give that disclaimer. So only 33% of neurodivergent Canadians are actually employed. And of those 33%, up to 86 are underemployed. So underemployed looks like folks who are only able to get part-time work. Also looks like folks who are only able to get like contract work. Really just like underemployed refers to like a lack of stability in their employment status. Like there's concerns, there's anxieties associated with that. So like, again, only 33% are actually employed. Almost all of them that are employed are experiencing underemployment, which is an alarming statistic. Especially when we need to work to make money to live. And that's just to live. That's not even to do anything else, right? Only 4% of employers actually have a disability talent strategy, which is an alarmingly low number. And again, that's also, I think, just like indicating a very broad disability talent strategy. That's not specific to like how well they're doing. And I think something that I have noticed both in my research and my own like lived experiences is that those disability talent strategies also like are very limited. Whether that's just like, okay, like we'll get you hooked up with like an occupational therapist to do an assessment of your specific needs, and then you'll go about your day. rather than, again, like what kinds of universal changes, hint for a few slides ahead, what kind of universal changes can we make to impact everyone? And then only 22% of neurodivergent employees report receiving any tools, training, or supports at work. And again, that's not like being satisfied with receiving those resources and things. That's just they've received some. And again, like these statistics are really alarming. And so back to this ecological model, there's a couple different areas of intervention. So between that, like at that individual level, that's where things like disability accommodations fit. Because like, you know, I as an individual may experience XYZ symptoms. And so these are the very specific accommodations that I need to help me succeed. Again, whether that's in the workplace or in a school setting. And exactly like what Demarcus said, like it's important to ask and not assume. And so like what looks like helpful for me is going to look helpful for a different person. Where I'm hoping that we can continue to frame the rest of our conversation is at in between that, I gotta make sure I say it right, in between the exo and macro system, where like inclusion policies fit in. And so recognizing that I don't, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm off base, but I don't know that many of us are like HR professionals. And I don't know that many of us are like medical practitioners who are able to actually prescribe specific accommodations in the workplace. And so this is where it's like, what can we do on a universal level to help set everyone up for success? And so that's where something like universal design for learning can be really, really helpful. And so universal design for learning is based on universal design. And so universal design is like, is a concept's not the right word, but we're going with it. But essentially it's like when we have elevators for everyone to use, when we have ramps for everyone to use, when we have like buttons that open doors, right? Like those are available for anyone to use. There's no like barrier for someone to use that specific accommodation. So it's universal design specifically in like a classroom setting, which also can very easily overlap with a hiring process, especially also recognizing what our hiring processes look like, what our training processes look like. There's that heavy overlap with education. So in the chat, I'm going to go through like the 3 key principles. In the chat, I'm going to go by each principle one by one, and I'm hoping that folks can give examples of each one. So if you could, or definition rather. So what do you think a multiple means of representation are? Yeah, it's really can be as simple as exactly what Jessica just said. Just like providing information and content in multiple formats. So are we providing our content only in visual formats? Are we providing them only in auditory formats? Let me tell you, if I was a student staff and training was just like I had to listen to a podcast, I would have done terrible as a student staff. Making sure that we're catering to diverse learning preferences and needs. And so when it's something that's also really important in the context of UDL is that when we're doing this planning for training, when we're doing this planning for hiring process, we're making sure that those multiple formats are just available to everyone without requesting it. Because that's something that is very, very common in like accommodations, right? Like you have to request an additional format. Whereas if we're trying to actually utilize and embed UDL into what we're doing, it's going to be available for everyone, no request. Multiple means of engagement. What do we think multiple means of engagement refers to? Yep, verbally and written, yeah. Yes, EJ, yes. Individual work, group work, case studies, reflection. Yeah, Jessica, group, individual, active, passive. So yeah, essentially like different ways of engaging with that content. So yeah, the different kinds of ways that we're actually teaching folks. So whether that's like people need to go and do certain elements of individual work, but then other things are group settings, other things are case studies, other things are just reflections. Also, which this next part is, I think, can be a little bit challenging when we want to make sure our student staff, especially, are like universally well trained, but like, can we give them any sort of agency in the order that they do training in? Like if any of you folks have staff do like online training before they attend, is there a way for you to consider them being able to choose what order that they're doing certain trainings in, and things like that. And then, yeah, like the group, individual, active, or passive. So like, what kinds of learnings does it need to be? Like, are there certain learnings? I think we all have probably said once or twice that like, oh, that meeting could have been an email, but like, truly, are there different opportunities for us to be able to just give them certain information in a written format versus like what we're saving for an actual training session, what we're saving for an actual meeting? And then lastly, what do we think multiple means of expression refers to in this context? That's okay. You're allowed to be stumped. Yeah, yeah. Multiple means of expression is how are we allowing students? Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. Jessica, yes. Having them say it back what they learned. Yeah. So multiple means of expression is how are we allowing folks to demonstrate their learning? So is it that like, are we assessing based on like one-on-one conversations? Are we assessing their learning based on like assessment surveys that go out at the end of a presentation? Are like, really, it's just like, how are we assessing that they've learned a certain topic? It really, in a classroom setting, like it's very easy to like illustrate. So like, our assessments, like written tests, our assessment, multiple choice questions, our assessment, does assessment look like a presentation back to the class? Things like that. It's just, that is how are we allowing them to express the learning. Yeah, we typically assess what staff remember, not always what they've learned. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think speaks to also like when we're doing standardized assessment in whatever ways that look like, whether that's in our context or like a classroom context, we lose certain pieces of what else did they learn when we're trying to make sure that they've learned very specific things. Amazing. So we'll talk a little bit about the employee life cycle. So this is like a very specific graphic, got lots of different steps. It's funny because I've done this presentation a few different times. I've talked about this with a few different people. And usually in past times that I've done this presentation, I've been like, oh yeah, and then the happy leavers, whatever, we don't really need to talk about that. But I actually, in a conversation with a student staff this past August during training, when I was talking about this, they were talking about how important it really is to make sure that we're doing that, like we're being really holistic in this whole employee life cycle, because when we have happy leavers, whether it's student staff or professional staff, they're doing marketing for us, right? They're telling their peers, they're telling their friends how much they enjoyed that job experience. And that's going to increase how many people, or like the different kinds of people that are applying to roles. So really, correcting my past self, that happy leavers is actually like making sure we have happy leavers or even neutral leavers is a really important stage of the employee life cycle. For our purposes, however, I have simplified it into job posting, into interview, and into onboarding and coaching. Again, recognizing that all of us probably have different levels of influence over these things, but hopefully you can take what you can from this presentation and go back to your institution, figuring out how you can implement different things. So with job postings, it's important to make sure that we're being purposeful with the selection of the social emotional skill requirements. So especially in residence life, right? And in student housing as a whole, like there's a huge emphasis on being empathetic. And but it's, so how are we very specifically highlighting what it is that we require them to demonstrate in their role? Because sometimes, and I think probably many of us can speak to job postings we've seen that just list like every possible word on there. And it's like, what are we really needing a staff to have? Use simple and clear language in job postings. So again, especially in the context of higher education, I think sometimes because of the colonial roots, because of the elitist roots of university, of college, we're often sometimes maybe using very specific wording, using jargon, right? Or using like very complicated words to build us up. Is that what we want to be hiring for? Write job postings that reflect organizational culture. Again, like what we're putting in a job posting says a lot to people who are going to apply to a job. And then, yes, you are correct that it would require a very strong relationship with human resources, depending on how much say you have in job posting. So yeah, there are some institutions, and maybe this is where my like Canadian experience is different. There's a distinct chance. But even at the different institutions that I've worked for, there's some places I've worked for where like, nope, it's like a very specific HR specific template. Whereas there are some other schools where like the hiring managers or like the directors of a department have a lot more influence in saying what actually goes into a job posting. And then this last point as well, this one also is very much a very HR specific process. But if you're identifying that this can be a barrier for folks, maybe it's something that you want to choose to advocate for. So simplifying the application process and offer accommodation. So again, like I think this is often one of the points that we have like the least control over, what the actual hiring or application process looks like. But having an application process where you have to type out everything that's on your resume, even though you're also still uploading a copy of your resume. I hate when I have to do that on a job site. Hate it so much. And there's definitely been times where like the application process on a website has been so tedious, and I've had to do so many click-throughs. I've had to create a new account every single time that I just am like, you know what, I don't care. I'm not going to apply for this job. And so again, like what are the different ways in which someone who is neurodivergent feels a barrier from even applying to a job? Yeah, audio feature, or even like a presentation where someone breaks down key points of the job. Yeah, that's a really good point, because even whether that's on the job site itself, like through HR, or whether that's even on like your housing website, right? Like where can you do that marketing? Can you share that information that again speaks to like that like office culture a little bit more. And so related to job postings, so studies show that neurodivergent folks often take job postings literally. And if they don't meet every single criterion on a job posting, they won't apply. So if we're overloading our job postings with all of these different things that we don't necessarily need 100% on, a neurodivergent person is going to be significantly less likely to apply. And I know I've seen this same stat with regards to like women applying for jobs, with regards to like racialized folks applying to jobs. And so again, like truly right from the get-go with a job posting, what barriers are we implementing? And then using certain words in job descriptions can provide insight into how the company values morale, for better or for worse. So again, especially in the very social jobs that we work in, how are we representing the importance of like the social connection without making it seem like, oh, we have to be one big happy family and like toxic overworking culture and things like that. So the interview process. So there's a few things here, which again, this can be depending on your institution, somewhere where you have more control over, or it might not be. So consider the environments in which the interview process occurs. So noisy and distracting environments can create discomfort for candidates with sensory needs, and like might just be really distracting. So every single noise that they hear every time a door opens, they might turn and then get distracted and lose track of where they were in their conversation or what they were saying. Can you provide as many details as possible about actually how to get to a location before they even show up for the interview? Whether it's like, where was I going with that? There can be a lot of anxiety that comes about just the unknown. And so if someone's coming to your institution for the very first time for a job interview, or coming to your office for the very first time for a job interview, there's so much anxiety in that unknown. So can we give them details on parking? Can we give them details on how to navigate from the parking lot to the building or to the room? Can we give them details on like, okay, there's going to be this person sitting at this desk. You're going to check in with them. They're going to let us know. And then you just wait until we come get you. Another thing in terms of environments, right? Like what can we offer virtual interviews? Because again, sometimes for some folks, being able to perform in an environment that's comfortable for them helps them perform better. Whereas for me, I actually hate a virtual interview. So again, it's giving those options can be really helpful. Giving those options without requiring like specific accommodation. Provide details of what will happen in the interview. So do you have a presentation component? Do you have case studies? Do you have just interview questions? Process should emphasize skills relevant to the role. So again, really making sure that what we're assessing is what we need someone to have. And even in that assessment, right, like what skills are like non-negotiables for them to come in with versus what are coachable, being really intentional with that. And then we should be making sure that we're focusing on content instead of delivery. So, I've done interview process, like I've been an interviewer before and have been told to like, there's been on rubrics, right? Like, oh, candidate appeared nervous, candidate didn't make great eye contact. Think about how exclusionary that is. We should be focusing on what they're saying, not how they're performing in the moment, because interviews are scary. Regardless, they're scary. I think 8+ hour interviews should be lawfully banned. I also think multiple part interviews should be banned. I think culture fit interviews can be a little bit of a question mark where you have to meet colleagues and then they assess how you fit in with them. I digress. I will make sure that this presentation gets passed along to folks also, so that you can also have my notes and like have more details about this. I'm going to skip over this part just for the sake of time. Onboarding. So this is something that's really important. And I think also all of us probably maybe will be giggling a little bit about. So orientation is I think what most of us experience. And that takes place over a few days. So review of policies and procedures, you complete your paperwork. And then onboarding is actually what's more comprehensive. And I don't know that many of us really experience much of the time. But that being said, our student staff hopefully are experiencing a very comprehensive onboarding process with training and everything like that. So onboarding should be taking place over multiple months. The purpose is to guide and develop new employees. And so something that can be really, really helpful with that is like creating a sort of onboarding roadmap. So having like a document compiled where there's checklists and other appropriate job aids. So like for submitting documentation, like what does your conduct system look like that way? Like making sure there's like step-by-step manuals or guides that help them with that stuff. A glossary, every single university or college has their own different terms, has their own different acronyms. How can we make sure that our employees, whether student staff or full-time professional staff, know what those are? Timetables or schedules, clarity around expectation of schedules, right? So like if people have flexibility with what their schedule looks like, outlining what the like minimum requirements are. Performance expectations. So again, like I think all of us, especially when it comes to student staff, complete performance summaries likely at least once a year. So like, is there something that we can provide staff at the beginning of their time with us, at the beginning of their contracts, that outlines what those expectations are, so they have a sense for like what those expectations are? And then the next point, a feedback plan, like what happens if you don't meet those expectations? What does that process look like? Departmental structure and role explanations, an FAQ. So something that we actually started doing this summer after I did some of this little research here, is in our summer newsletters that we were sending up to our student staff, we started collecting like questions in a survey. And so now at the end of each like kind of like training cycle, I'm saving those in one big document. So then that way we can provide that information with those answers to staff every time they come in. Workplace norms and culture expectations. So this next one I'll explain a little bit more on the next slide. And then resource directory. So with regards to workplace norms and like culture and expectations, this is where onboarding someone, as regardless of what the role is, but I find this is especially helpful in a professional staff context. This can be really helpful at like teaching staff things that we have a hard time articulating on paper, right? So partnering up like a new staff member with like a seasoned veteran staff member who's in a same or very similar job, so that they can speak to what the day-to-day often looks like. They can speak to how they usually prioritize different things. They should be knowledgeable in the role and campus landscape. They should be able to provide encouragement and guidance, help employees find answers and solutions. And then, like I said, just like offering guidance about social expectations and like unwritten conventions of the workplace, so that we're not just like throwing someone in and going, okay, have fun, figure it out. Especially, for some neurodivergent folks where there's like maybe some struggles with those social cues, like throwing them in without any guidance and trying to figure out those unwritten conventions is like incredibly challenging and also just quite frankly ableist. Coaching. So there's like two categories that common performance concerns of neurodivergent employees fall into. So working memory, which I talked about, that like immediate memory piece, and then self-efficacy. So in terms of coaching conversations related to each of these, so with concerns that could fall into working memory, providing opportunities to practice when someone's developing a new skill, which I think is something that we're really, really good for like student staff training, not something we're as good for professional staff training. And so again, like how can we offer them those opportunities? It's helpful to like frame these developments as mastery in a social context. So also like when they're successfully completing like a task or something that's related to like a job requirement, like connecting it also to like the social context. So it's like when we're failing to meet these things, this is how it's impacting your peers. Oh, thank you so much. Hopefully I'm finishing up shortly. Apologies everyone. And then in terms of self-efficacy, a mix of different types of coaches is important. So whether that's like yourself as a supervisor, whether that's like campus partners coming in and doing training and things like that. But then the self-efficacy, it's really self-efficacy is related to that confidence and that confidence in their ability to complete the job. And so when you're helping someone develop that confidence, you want to make sure that like you're helping them develop something like a goal that's in clear relation to the role. And then also you're like helping them outline the different steps that go into developing a goal. I think sometimes, you know, especially for some staff who might not be meeting our expectations, like, okay, like you need to set a goal related to this, especially in the context of neurodivergent staff. Like it's really helpful and important if we're like very specific in helping them set that up, because it gives them a clear pathway to be able to replicate in the future. And also it just like allows them to see like a very clear progress that they've made from like point A to point B, which really helps in developing that confidence. And then workplace adjustments. Oh, what did I just do? Okay, there we go. Sorry. Workplace adjustments. So I'll go over these just really quickly. So executive function coaching. So again, like sometimes folks will struggle with knowing how to plan, knowing how to prioritize your other organizational skills. So who can we connect with them with to help them develop that? Again, different training, like how are we giving them training? What training materials are we allowing them to keep on going? Are we giving ongoing training as well? Workstation adjustments, so use of dual monitors, whiteboards, other memory aids, standing desks. I think I skipped over one slide. Flexibility, so use of private meeting rooms, noise canceling headphones, redesign of shared workspaces. Something that's been really helpful for me, especially for the really minuscule tasks, tedious tasks that I like put off a lot, is like co-working or like body doubling. And so like I find a colleague who like I like to work with, and I sit in their office and I get what I need to get done. Then it's just there's a psychology behind why it works, but essentially just having another person there, even though I'm not even talking to them, helps me get those small things done that I need to get done. So what kind of spaces or what kind of culture can we create where that makes that the norm or makes that more socially acceptable? Scheduling flexibility, assistive tech, so speech to text, text to speech software, mind mapping software, specialist spell checkers designed for dyslexia. So again, like a lot of the work that we do requires a lot of typing and writing, right? Especially in terms of documentation. And so like for staff who maybe have struggles with like writing and reading skills, like what kind of supports can we set up for them so that they're still able to do the job? Because really it's important, but also it's a small part of the job at the same time. And then planning and memory software. So this is where there'd be an activity, wouldn't have worked. So that's why we went a little bit longer with some of the other stuff. But what I'll make sure that I do is I will send out everyone, or Alyssa will send out to everyone, some of the resources that I've compiled over the times that I've done this presentation. So you have like the blank templates for you to do like this activity with your colleagues, as well as also what I've compiled from other folks that have sat in on the presentation, as like some starting points for ideas of how you could implement some of these things into your own workplace. And that is my presentation, everyone.